morning. It's quite an honor to be invited here. I'm very pleased to be here. Already 2 excellent talks. And now we're going to kind of jump off the cliff into something a bit much more complex because we're going to bring people into the equation. And so I look at social ecological systems, which is what that acronym SES is. First time I heard of networks, I didn't realize I was hearing about it. A social scientist I know was interviewing a family in a house in Guatemala, and she mentioned to them that maybe it would be good if she spoke with another family. And the family, they listened, and they said, no, that's too far. And to her shock, she learned later that the other family only lived 2 houses away. And it took me a while to understand with her what was going on. Sorry, I don't know why that happened. Doesn't like me. The Kalahari is a place with very patchy resources, very patchy soil, very patchy rainfall, and if you're a herdsman, you have to move your cows where the resources are. There you can see the patchiness of the vegetation. And the point is that you must integrate the variability of the landscape with your movement as a herdsman. The point is, though, that you can't simply go where the rainfall is unless you know the people there. And so your social network, in a sense, has to be complex enough to deal with the very high complexity, the spatial heterogeneity of, which is a dynamic heterogeneity from year to year as to where you find resources. And that's the answer to my friend's question. They were 2 houses away, but this family didn't know them. And so it was very far away. That's the only metaphor they could come up with. It's very far. I've been looking in the last several years with Chris Rye, who has been working in the Sahel for over 30 years, at a wonderful success story. As an ecologist, I was so tired of looking at disasters. And here, instead, to completely destroy the myth of the Sahara inexorably marching south, 200 million trees have appeared over 5 million hectares in the Maradi and Zinder regions of Niger since about 1990. Now, you can look, and if you want to talk about patchiness here you have droughts, you have one enormous disaster after another, maybe every 10 to 15 years. Droughts, famines, locust outbreaks. This was colonial war here, so this was the first Tuareg uprising. Here's the second Tuareg uprising. So there's kind of a punctuation of enormous disasters, but actually, just like the Kalahari, the spatial heterogeneity of resources here is incredible from year to year. You have to be incredibly adaptive to live in the Sahel. If you see people traveling to go to Lagos or Dakar and they come into a bus park, the first thing they'll do is find other farmers and start exchanging seeds. They're constantly doing things to adapt. Now, this might look like the typical disaster picture, right? Here we had the trees and here we've lost the trees, but actually this is the older picture and this is the newer picture. And if you keep in mind that there are 6 times as many people there now as there were in 1920, 600% growth, you've got more people and more trees. And actually, there have been some studies showing that this regrowth, this agroforestry is associated with actually higher places of human density. Yes, we've had more rain since 1987, but rainfall does not explain the regreening. And if you go south to Nigeria, where there should be more rain, there are no trees. Something is happening in society there in Niger that is not happening in Nigeria. Wonderful for women. Maybe women will finally have time to get an education if they're not spending 3 hours collecting firewood as opposed to 30 minutes. But what I want to talk about here is the network aspects of this, because these people are ranked 185th on the Human Development Index. Some of the most friendly people you ever want to meet, and some of the poorest people you'll ever meet. And they are too poor to buy fertilizer, but they must, with 6 times as many people, they must intensify their agriculture. If they can't do it with fertilizer, what you have to do is the way they did it traditionally, and that is you invite the herdsmen onto your field with sugar and tea, hoping the cattle will stick around and give you some dung. This is a map, just to give you some idea of the complexity of it, the pathways for the cows, the grazing areas, the watering holes. This is a map drawn by local people in an interview. And this, what we were doing with Chris, was to try, we did a systems analysis. This is a paper that's about to come out in Ecology and Society. This is a systems analysis trying to show some of the feedbacks that are reinforcing each other now. So here, this fodder in the field, in other words, if you live in these kind of environments, you must move your cattle over large areas to integrate that variability. This means that either you are depending on cattlemen to come there, or you hope they might move your cattle. And because of this need, what's happened now is the farmers have started making migration corridors, which I was just showing you there, reinforcing them, and also they're bringing the herders into the decision making. In a sense, their network is changing, and they are reinforcing it, such that now this is becoming a positive, reinforcing feedback that is improving their relations and making them more resilient. So I only have 20 minutes, and I want to just first speak about a place where it's obvious that your network has to be complex enough to deal with environmental variability. I would like now to go to the title of my talk. In German, this is the Tisza River, or the Tisza. It has some of the most dramatic flood dynamics in Europe. This is one of the flattest areas of Europe, the Alfeld, this alluvial plain here, and these are the Carpathians. The water there can rise 12 meters in 24 hours. Maria Theresa rewarded people for their war exploits by giving them land grants, and they organized local peasants to completely transform this valley back in the 18th and 19th centuries. And what they did is they transformed what was a polyculture of nut trees and fruit trees and some of the most productive fisheries in all of Europe that was feeding a good deal of the Hungarian-Austrian Empire. It is now has no fisheries, no nutted fruit trees. It became a monoculture for grain. You had expanding urban populations, you had a lot of war, and you had to feed cavalry with war in the 19th century, and they also did this so they could export grain. So this was the conversion. Now, this made a lot of money for people, and it was very successful for a while, but we had a series of disastrous floods over the last 20 years, and it seems with these floods that the idea that you could, by engineering, get ahead of the curve is evaporating. It seems like every time you improve the dikes, the next flood went over the top, and maybe we can't engineer our way out of these crises. And if you look here, certainly this is now the economically most depressed part of Hungary. Like every single one of these is divided by the national average in every aspect. I can take you to villages there on the Ukrainian border with 60 to 70% unemployment. Now, during the socialist time, there were a number of socialist projects which were not agreed to by a minority within Hungary, and since about 1980, a shadow network has been developing, which has been politely ignored, mildly tolerated by the government there in Hungary. And what they've been doing, basically, is developing an alternative narrative about how to manage rivers. And so, in every way that they could, they have been trying to get research money. They're scientists, they're academics, they're also people in ministries, and they're also, thank you, and they're also local activists, local mayors. It's quite a mix. And so a lot of it is kind of informal learning, very much that they are not developing a power of prediction, but they're trying to get as much as they can to support a credible narrative. You might say, hoping for a Chernobyl moment or a Fukushima moment, when the current narrative gets questioned and people look around and say, is there another narrative? Is there another way that we could look at this? And so what we're dealing here with, though, is regime change. Now, when we talk about regime, many people sometimes think of regime as only people. And so when we think of regime, you know, we think of who are the characters lining up there on Red Square. I would say that you understand a regime, you have a qualitative understanding. People here go bicycling in the Weinviertel, they go hiking in the Alps, in the Waldviertel, because the cultural landscape is a precious thing in Europe, which is a totally different management regime from what you find in agricultural landscapes like Australia or the United States. You know it, you feel it when you go there. People go for tourism here. They're not going for tourism in the cornfields of Illinois. You know you're in a different management regime. So I would put to you that a management regime is the set of paradigms and icons and defining visions. It's the technologies, the built environment, it's your institutions, as well as your actors and organizations and networks, and the biophysical and social. These are all reinforcing each other in ways that allow it to persist. And so you have a management regime in Hungary that has persisted for 200 years. It's highly resilient. And unfortunately, if you think about the potential danger of climate change, you could say it could be pathologically resilient. So here, this isn't something where we want to build resilience. Here, resilience is a challenge. Can we make a transition to a management regime which is basically more adaptive and can deal with the increased variability we anticipate under climate change? And so far, we find that there's enormous path dependency there in Hungary, and we are not even able to get the experiments and pilot projects that would allow us to prove alternative ways of managing. Nobody knows exactly what to do. We're trying to get, so to say, the shadow network is trying to get the right to experiment. So here is the paradigm. This is, when you talk to farmers in Hungary, in many places, water is evil, and here you have your monoculture flooded. This is something most people don't know. You get flooding even if the water doesn't go over the dikes, it seeps up from below, what is called water stagnation. And you get hundreds of millions of euro in damage. This is the alternative. This is an apple tree with 2 meters of flooding. Now, I learned wetlands ecology in Florida. I'm a wetlands ecologist by original training. And in Florida, if a tree were flooded to 2 meters, after 2 days it would be dead. And this just simply shows you that these people, over hundreds of years, selected and developed their own culture. And during, it is known that they had over 1,000 varieties of pear and 1,000 varieties of apples. So there's enormous agrobiodiversity there they developed on their own. So this is the other paradigm. You might say the shadow networks paradigm. We could live with the river. So, going back, actually, resilience was extremely well defined over the last two. I would just simply hearken to this. The amount of change a system can undergo and retain the same controls, the same feedbacks. So you might say that if the ball is the state of the system and it's rolling around here, the shape of this is being determined by the set of feedbacks that is keeping the system in place. So what we have here then, what the shadow network is facing is this challenge. Here we have the current river management regime with this paradigm, and can we make this transition to a different kind of regime? Can we overcome the resilience of the current system? Now, Lance Gunderson here has published on this, Brian Walker has published on this. They have looked at, you might say, indicators of transformability. Let's be quite clear about this. If you want to innovate, often you have to take risks. And when you take risks, your resilience may go down. So we have the skunk works for developing super secret military. We have an organizational management theory. There's the decoupling and recoupling. You have a young person in your organization with brilliant ideas. Often you have to decouple that person and isolate them, let them develop the idea, and then recouple them and bring them in the process. This is the kind of transition we're talking about here. Anyway, one of the things that people in the Resilience Alliance have identified is this presence of an epistemic network or a shadow network and different learning types, and that's what's been going on. Now, I worked with them for a while with systems analysis in using conceptual modeling in the system dynamics tradition to simply try to flesh out their ideas about why the system was resilient. So you have here, for instance, these two super powerful reinforcing feedback loops causing your agriculture to intensify. And because of that, they of course have the profits to lobby and basically change or maintain the dike management structure, which minimizes the crop damage. Normally, under most circumstances, the crop damage would have dampened this and completely changed the system. They've been able to get around it. So, in a sense, with the shadow network, we've been able to flesh out our hypotheses as to why the current system is so resilient. Then we also were looking, and I'm sorry we can't go into this, but there were about 12 or 14 reasons, we might say barriers to transition. And instead of a list, we saw that actually all of these are related to one another. So you have the legacy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, giving you continued centralized top-down management in Budapest. And this is basically hindering the bottom-up pressure, which is in turn, as we found out, has not been able to maintain the leadership toward transition that is necessary. It would take probably a good half hour to an hour to go through this entire diagram. I'm giving you examples of ways we've worked with them in trying to look at the feedbacks that are keeping the current system in place. Now, one of the problems is when you do participatory science is that you're very happy people show up. And you can't guarantee that you'll get all opinions in society. And we have been following here the work of Mary Douglas, an anthropologist, which says that in every society you find 4 basic ways of explaining nature. And it's not that people personify these are as if it's kind of an argument. Here's a self-organizing process. The more you use this kind of argument, the more you feel in solidarity with other people who use it. And so we have here the individualists who very much are, by kind of Ayn Rand, would favor, business, market solutions. We have egalitarians who believe in very flat organizational structures, hierarchists who are functioning very well in the army and bureaucracy, and fatalists who believe that there's no pattern, everyone is crazy, and they're just coping. So the problem with our efforts so far is, this, by the way, is our Nepalese former Minister of Water, and this is how he found it very useful in his work with water management in Nepal. Here are some Nepalese examples of individualists, fatalists, hierarchists, and egalitarians. But the point I would like to make is that we basically in the shadow network found mostly egalitarians, and that they would go back when they were looking for explanations for why this system was not functioning. They went to military maps made 300 years ago and said, aha, this must be the truth. This is what we need to impose. And this, of course, that's a long discussion as to, what we were saying is you can't be romantic, you can't go back to the past. What we need is to do adaptive management, and we need to explore and find out what will work, because the soil is different, society is different. Nature and society are moving targets, and we can't simply return to a romantic vision of 300 years ago. So the network, if you want to say now, when you look at a network and say, how is it influencing the resilience of the system, you have then, it really begs the question for the shape of the network and what are the icons that define it. What we have done is gone and started working with work started by Eleanor Ostrom in trying to see how people in networks have generated new knowledge and generated also institutions. And we have mapped that. So this, for instance, is a map showing how knowledge, operational outcomes, institutions, and action situations have affected one another, generating new institutions and knowledge and moving forward. This, of course, is, I can't go through here. This is a map of a policy process for over 11 years in Hungary, and all you need to know is that this is the bottom-up regional movement. This is how it affected the ongoing policy process to 2003. They generated regional dialogues and experiments, and then here is where the policy process stalled, and it's time to end. We went and looked at these interactions and tried to see which of the elements that have been associated with adaptive regimes were involved in the interactions that generated these institutions and knowledge. I would just simply end to say that this is a new tool we've been using to try to understand how these networks have functioned and how they affect the resilience of the system. And I would say we're kind of at the stage of a botanist in 1805. We are collecting and looking for patterns at the moment. We're nowhere near as far along as people looking at ecosystems. It's quite a complex situation. One thing I would finish with, though, is leadership is critical. And I think the people in the network realize it. Because of a leadership change in the Hungarian parliament, they were in the national debate, and then the leadership changed again, and they were out of the national debate, and their effectiveness went down.